I'd like for us to stop today for a moment and think about the traditions that we practice. Tough thing about that is sometimes we don't know when we're practicing something as a tradition or what. But I'd like you to concentrate on that and think about what are the traditions we practice, not just here at church, by the way, but just in our lives, writ large, in our families. So think about it this way: the things that we do that matter to us, things near and dear to us, so we do them on a regular basis. Although that's kind of broad. So to narrow it down a little bit, let's just think about our holiday traditions, what we do around the holidays. So in your family, what does Christmas look like? Do you come to a Christmas Eve service at church? Whether you do that or not, do you have a big family meal that evening? Is that night also, if you're with family, that you exchange Christmas presents with them? Or is your practice to wake up on Christmas Day in the morning, perhaps, and have a big breakfast and then exchange presents after that because Santa Claus has come overnight to deliver the presents, right? Or do you breakfast, rip open the presents first thing, and then have a big brunch or a lunch? So several years ago, I was a minister of a church where we supported a men's shelter. So this was a place where it was for men who were recovering, perhaps from addiction. Many of them had been homeless, and it was a place where they could really focus on reclaiming their lives. It was a wonderful institution, and our church decided that we would deliver Christmas presents for every man that was living there. And so we filled up and we delivered 120 toiletry kits, DOP kits, and we would take them over on Christmas morning, and then we would share with them a big Christmas brunch. And so privately, there were some members of my church who came to me and said, "Look, can't we find another time to do this? I mean, that's when my whole family will be at home and the kids will be opening presents and then we eat. That's our tradition. We just can't make it work to do anything else." I understood. I said, traditions are important, and this is something of a sacrifice. I get it. But then we had plenty of other church members who did go to the shelter that Christmas morning, all of them breaking their family traditions to one degree or another. My own kids moaned and groaned about it all the way there. Why were we disrupting our Christmas tradition? They wanted to know. They scowled at me like I was breaking some hard and fast rule and their lives would be ruined forever. Years of therapy would follow. But then we arrived at the shelter that morning with our gifts and saw what it meant to these men. And when we sat down with them and ate with these gentlemen who were away from their own families or whose families had disowned them, I really don't know a single member of my church who was there that day who did not come away with a fresh understanding of the difference between sticking to tradition and the gift of doing something that goes beyond tradition. I think traditions are a lot like a familiar path or a trail that you might follow through the woods. You get to know every place where there's a particular tree or a boulder over here. You know how long it takes to reach a certain clearing. So if you travel that path often enough, it just becomes second nature to you, and you have memories of what has happened at different spots all along the way. Here's where I came across that rabbit that time that just stared at me forever before scampering off. And over here, that's where I always pause and look up at the sky because one time I saw a big flock of geese passing over and it was just magical. Or this is that dogwood tree with amazing, beautiful blossoms every spring. And here's the spot where I was walking with my friend when he told me he had cancer. And right at this bend of the trail is where I finally decided I had to gather up my courage and make that phone call to my brother after all these years of angry silence. So traditions matter. And there are a lot of landscape that we travel through, full of markers, full of memories. And although things change, and we make new traditions and decisions within the space of our traditions, the traditions themselves can remain. They can become so important to us, so ingrained, so imprinted and woven into our hearts and minds that they can help us define and understand life itself. So it is perfectly understandable for us to respond with great alarm when something comes along to disrupt a tradition. What do we do when we've been walking along the same familiar path through the woods for years and suddenly we learn that someone has bought up all that land and is going to build a housing development? Naturally, we're indignant. And if we have any power to stop that from happening to something that's so near and dear to us, something that matters so much, something we feel ownership of because it helps us understand who we are, we'll complain, we'll fuss, we'll obstruct, we'll do whatever it takes to keep that tradition intact. Now, if we didn't know it already, our scripture today makes it crystal clear that Jesus was not always fond of traditions. Which is kind of funny if we think about it, because we've built up so many traditions around him. Now, in certain circles, Jesus would buck traditions, and that made him very unpopular. It's not that he wanted to toss out a tradition just for the sake of rocking the boat. It's more that by the day and age that Jesus came along, the Jews had taken the essence of many religious laws, and over time they had added layer upon layer of traditions. And since the traditions, they could trace their lineage back to a certain law or another, the traditions themselves, they took on the importance of something quite sacred. When in fact, as Jesus points out in this passage, a practice like making sure that you wash your hands in a particular way really doesn't have a lot to do with anything God actually cares about, at least not for the average person. That was a law intended for the priests in the temple, not for everyone. So this was a lot like the rule of waiting 30 minutes after you eat before you go swimming. My mom swore by that rule. Even though it's a scientific fact that eating before you swim really has no effect whatsoever on your swimming ability, what is true is that sometimes exerting yourself too much in any way, whether it's swimming or something else, right after eating, might cause you to get a big bellyache and even throw up. And no one in the pool wants that to happen. But strictly speaking, the rule about not swimming until 30 minutes after eating is nothing more than a tradition. It's handed down from one generation to another and to another until it just becomes the way that we do things. And carried only a little further, a tradition can actually sometimes cause harm. It can obscure the very intent the tradition was originally designed to lift up. And that was the point Jesus was making. The Pharisees and the scribes he was arguing with, who'd criticized Jesus and his followers, they were so imprinted with tradition that they had made tradition more important than the reason the tradition came about in the first place. The tradition said there was a right way to do things and only one right way, so the tradition was an essential thing. It was not an option. And if you didn't walk down that narrow path of doing it just so, you were not being faithful. It wasn't right. It's just not fitting. If you ignored tradition and continued to veer off the path, you were a heretic. Now, what had come about in the first place, the reason for all that piled up tradition was the concept of holiness. Holiness. What makes someone holy? What makes someone acceptable to God and accessible to God? Or to be more accurate, how do you encounter God in your life? How do you encounter holiness? And Jesus was saying, if you think that experiencing the holy love of God means you first have to wash your hands in a particular way, I'm afraid you're missing the point. So it's not a tradition that is worth keeping. Now, before we go off, as we often do, and think of ourselves as so much wiser than the Pharisees, we ought to step back and to be fair, consider what we think of as essential and hold all of that up to the Jesus test. Now, the Jesus test is pretty simple. Sometimes it can hurt if it means we've made our traditions more important than what matters most. The Jesus test is simply this: is what we are doing in any given situation expressing the loving grace of God or not? If it's not, even something for as long as we can remember, and even if the people who came before us did the exact same thing, that's still just a tradition. If it fails the Jesus test of expressing the gracious love of God, but it's something that still feels good and comforting and right because it is so familiar, or it's just that we've always done things, then I'm sorry, that's still just a tradition. Now, that being said, many traditions may in fact express the loving grace of God. We may have traditions in our lives and in our families, where we work or here at church, where strangers are indeed welcomed as friends, where the needs of others are indeed put before our own, where we open our minds and hearts to new ideas. You may even have a tradition of intentionally trying something new and different every day of your life, but all too often, the tradition pathway we follow through the woods of life never leads us anywhere new and different to a place where we might experience the loving grace of God in a fresh way. And I know it's not easy to veer off the beaten path, to take the road less traveled. It can be scary to leave the familiar behind and venture into unknown territory. It can even feel unfaithful. The pull of tradition is that strong. It was strong enough that those Pharisees and scribes who criticized Jesus, who thought he was going too far off the beaten path, and the only way they could stop others from following him was to conspire to have him killed. But as we know, that even that did not work to keep people from following the new path that Jesus had created. When my son Charlie was a preschooler, I used to take him over to a playground that was in our neighborhood, and I would sit on the park bench with the other mothers, and we would watch our children play. Hopefully they would play well together. There was a very tall metal slide at the playground with a long set of steps leading up to the top before the thrilling quick ride down to the ground. One day I saw a little girl and her younger brother arguing fiercely with each other about who could get on that slide and who could not. The little girl was insistent her brother could not get on the slide. Why? He said. She said, because Mom says you're too small. You can never get on that slide. Never, ever, ever. You will fall down and get hurt. And the mother of these two kids happened to be sitting right next to me, and she called over, oh, that's okay. Let him go ahead. But the little girl then complained, but Mom, you said it was a rule. You said he's too small for his own safety. Mom laughed and said, that was a long time ago. He's much bigger now. You help him. So with great indignation, the little girl climbed up the ladder right behind her brother, and when they had both reached the top, she sat on his leg, holding him in her arms wrapped tightly around his chest, and they both looked unsure, but the mom said, go on, it'll be okay. And after a moment, the sister and the brother slid down together, and they landed safely at the bottom, laughing and smiling, and then they raced around again to climb back up the slide. And the mom looked over at me and she said, these kids, once they get a rule stuck in their heads, these kids, that playground story reminds me sometimes of how we can often operate together as a church. So I'd like to talk about our church just for a moment. Foothills is at an interesting juncture these days. Like a lot of churches, most churches really, most of our members are mature adults, and we don't have a lot of younger adults with children who are still living at home. But rather than being alarmed by that, my approach is to acknowledge the fact that statistically far fewer young adults with children attend any kind of church Now, I've talked about this before. It is just a fact. But too often, I think we tend to blame ourselves or wonder if there's something wrong with how we're doing things. But while I don't think it's ever productive to beat ourselves up, it is always instructive to ask, are any of our traditional ways of being, those aspects that feel right and comfortable and even carved in stone, are they truly expressing the loving grace of God, or are we doing them just because we've always done them? And that can be really hard to ever answer objectively. And maybe it's the wrong question. It is true that we should be exploring how we can provide worship and fellowship and learning and service opportunities that intentionally work much better for the schedules and the interests of a wide variety of people from every age group, including adults with children at home. But it's also true for any church, including ours, that we cannot and should not ever discount our strengths as a congregation and lean into what we do very well that expresses the loving grace of God already. Our strengths, as I see it, or I see them, is a very strong sense of connection and community and belonging, intellectual and spiritual curiosity and diversity, inclusivity, and the desire to serve and love our neighbor. And I think all of that is an expression of God's love and grace. And the important thing to acknowledge is those strengths are not age specific. There is no demographic limit on any of that stuff. Being a place of belonging and service to others and nurturing our spiritual selves matters. Whether you are 9 months old or years old, 90 years, or anywhere in between. Those are just basic human needs. So our greatest challenge is not found in the essential nature of who we are. That is solid, and that's a strength. It's in how we think about and how we practice who we are. It's in celebrating and bolstering our strengths while also creating new programs, even new traditions that will ensure that the great aspects of who we are accessible to everyone. So for every tradition we have or every new tradition we create, we only have to ask one simple question. Does this truly express the loving grace of God? If it does, then we will live into the joy of God's new and exciting pathway that is just waiting for us to explore together.